Well, my previous video did pretty well and was apparently quite prophetic, so I am once again here to talk about the amazing digital circus. The discourse surrounding this absolute gremlin of a show has given me quite a few ideas for things to ramble on about in videos. Last time out, I talked about how the digital circus fandom is setting themselves up for disappointment by allowing their headcanon, their own ideas of what the show should be, to overrule what the show is actually doing. But today I'm gonna throw that sect of the fandom a bone and talk about a good fan theory, but also why it's not actually a theory at all. Often, there's this sense in fandoms that things need to be explicit to be canon, or for the audience to even internalize, which goes back to what I said about the, at least in large part, young and immature audience of Digital Circus and how they, frankly, don't really seem to do a good job actually understanding the show. But, as any writer would tell you, the best way to write things is with subtlety and subtext, rather than making all the subtext explicit. The Amazing Digital Circus isn't exactly a subtle show, but it is a well-written one, so naturally it also employs subtext. I'm specific about the wording there to avoid saying it simply includes subtext, which could imply it has subtext by accident, or is just something the audience is imagining based on the explicit text. No, subtext is a method of conveying information actively used by the writer. The writer deliberately put the subtext there. They constructed the text in such a way as to get the implications across to the viewer. Obviously, subtext can also be accidental, but more often than not, the viewer reading between the lines is something the writer anticipated. The writer basically manipulated you into doing it. It's not a theory to say that Anton Chigurh is threatening this man's life during the coin toss scene. He understands what's at stake, and so do we. It's the intended reading, even though it isn't actually said. So, with all that said, we can now get to the Transjax theory. First of all, terrible name, does not roll off the tongue at all. Secondly, it's not a theory. Ever since episode 1, Jax has struggled with his own self-identity and with the idea of being perceived. He also says misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic things throughout the show, as well as bullying the characters a lot, especially Gangle. The reason he does all of that, and why he's actually a good, well-written, complex character, is because of his self-hatred. His whole deal is channeling self-hatred outwards. He belittles the other characters because he feels small himself. He makes fun of Zubo's body because he feels inadequate inside his own. He tries to turn everything into a joke so he can push everything and everyone away from him, because he's too scared to acknowledge how he really feels.
And if I do still have problems, I talk about them. With the people I trust.
Good thing I don't have any problems, then.
You could easily argue that every character in the show represents some part of Jax that he's trying to repress, like Ragatha representing a version of him that cares deeply for other people, but he hates her because acting like her would mean being vulnerable. Or Kane's inability to please who he sees as his friend, so he becomes vindictive and angry at them, toying with them to let out his pent-up anger over feeling unloved. Or Gangle, who represents his deep sadness and depression, which makes Jax not even try to get better, since he thinks things will never improve. Though Gangle is able to improve, especially feeling less sad all the time by becoming friends with Zubo, as Zubo helps her manage her feelings and support her through the things that upset her, exemplified perfectly by Gangle's comedy mask.
Do you think Gangle is actually capable of being happy?
What?
I don't know, like her comedy mask still breaks every day. Does she think hanging out with Zubul is gonna magically fix that?
This all relates to Jax being trans because a big part of his repression and self-hatred comes from not accepting himself for who he is, because acknowledging his actual feelings would require him taking them seriously and exposing his vulnerabilities to other people, which is his greatest fear. The entire idea of being and coming out as trans is inherently vulnerable. You're admitting that the persona you have built inside your own mind and other people's minds is wrong. So you're asking everyone, including yourself, to analyze you, see you as who you really are, instead of the performance you are forcing yourself to live through. It's also an act of optimism, as it means you actually see your own future as better than your present, given you can change who you are completely, which is antithetical to Jax's nihilistic and depressive worldview. With that, his very visceral reaction to the maid outfit makes it clear that Jax has some further reason inside him that makes him react that way. It's not just being the butt of the joke, which is definitely one of the things he hates, but it's the idea that he could be perceived as feminine, as anything other than he sees himself, which is masculine, uncaring, and unfeeling.
This is what peak male performance looks like. My ears and tail are kind of the pinnacle of masculinity.
You don't have a tail.
What are you talking about? Yes, I do. What the? Where's my tail? How long have I not had my tail?
I have never seen you with a tail.
Jack's saying that only for his tail to not be there, to have never been there in the show before that point, and for it to start appearing from that point onwards tells you everything you need to know. In episode 8, we learned that the humans can manifest things if they so wish, and Jax, seeing he's seemingly lost a part of why he finds himself masculine, manifests the tail onto his body for the rest of the show, overcompensating for what the tail not being there means for his self-image. Gooseworks is clearly tying Jax's tail to his masculinity, then telling you it isn't there, his masculinity isn't there, so he's overcompensating by making it appear, actively trying to be something he's not, because his body does not align with how he sees himself. Where have I heard that before? But, as I mentioned before, with the other characters representing repressed parts of Jax's personality, Zubo is the one that gets the most under his skin, because they're comfortable in who they are, in their self-expression and gender identity. Jax constantly pushes them and jokes about them not being straight and calls them princess and damsel, which they hate, but that's Jax's way of pretending Zubo is bothered by who they are, which, after episode 6 and Zubo's conversation with Gango about both of their avatar gimmicks, Zubo understands that loving yourself requires loving every part of you, including the parts you hate. Which is how Zubo realizes that the gimmick of their body having interchangeable parts actually works in their favor, as it means they don't have to commit to anything other than being themselves, which Jax is extremely envious of.
Aren't you supposed to be miserable about your ability to choose your own body or something?
I've been starting to think that maybe the ability to change is fine. Not needing to commit to one thing all the time.
How about that?
Gooseworks, the creator, writer, and director of the entire show, is herself a trans woman, and she has said many times that Jax is her self-insert character, that her intrusive thoughts got channeled onto him when she was writing. This is not to say that the other characters aren't self-inserts. I firmly believe every character is a self-insert in some way, though that's the topic for another video. But that Jax is the main self-insert in this case. This, then, explains how Goose's own struggles with figuring out her gender identity can be projected onto Jax, and paint a picture that Jax's character is more than just analogous to transness. It's worth keeping in mind that, as a trans writer, Goose was obviously aware of the implications of her writing, made explicitly clear by her constant jokes about Jax in the maid outfit in her social media, and she did all of it deliberately. All of this to say that I think Jax is way more than just implied to be trans, but he almost explicitly is.
Seems fitting for you, though. I figured you'd be into this.
What does that mean?
When writing, you show the audience 2 + 2 and let them figure out the answer's 4. Goose may not have explicitly told you that Jax is trans, but she sure as hell has given us all the pieces to put this puzzle together. To me, that's extremely valid trans representation. I understand why a lot of people hold queer representation to a very high standard, since more often than not, many corporate artists hide behind the implicitness of said representation to seem more palatable to certain audiences, see Disney. But I also feel that wanting representation to be fully explicit with no room for error is somewhat missing the point of art. Like I said, you guide the audience towards an answer, you don't just tell it to them. Compare the subtext of Jax being trans to something like Yasmin Khan and the 13th Doctor having feelings for each other in Doctor Who, and it's night and day. The former is a clearly deliberate choice that guides you to an interpretation of the character that makes perfect sense, while the latter was accidental and only became canon after the fans insisted for it to be canon. It was never intended by the writer Chris Chibnall when he was making the show, so it couldn't really be considered good queer representation, especially with how it skimps out at the end of Series 13, and they don't even so much as kiss. Now, to get a little autistic with it, I will show you this handy graph I've made that explains what I mean. There are different levels of trans coding, and the line in the middle is where I'd say we cross over from not being trans representation to actually being valid trans representation. Before we do that, let's talk about dysphoria. Dysphoria is defined as severe unhappiness, especially a person's feeling of being very uncomfortable in their body or of being in the wrong body. Dysphoria is a universal feeling. Feeling uncomfortable in your body is not unique to trans people, but it is one of the main experiences that comes with transness. So let's get to the graph. We have a few marks here starting from not trans, going to analogous, where the character isn't implied to be trans but has experiences that are akin to the trans experience, like Rumi from K-pop Demon Hunters, who's a half-demon with patterns all over her body that show she's a demon, and was thus told to hide that side of herself her whole life until she could get rid of it, which ends up hurting her and making her feel dysphoric. Clearly analogous and even intended by the filmmakers, but Rumi herself is not trans. Further to the right, we have implied. where the text goes further than having just experiences that are similar to the trans experience, but actually indicate that the character might be trans. Like Gwen in Across the Spider-Verse, who not only has the similar experiences with dysphoria and acceptance of her identity, but also the implications from the colors when she pours her heart out to her dad, and the trans flag in her room. And finally, all the way to the right, we have explicit trans characters like Jules from Euphoria or Zubul from The Amazing Digital Circus, which is self-explanatory. I'd put Jax right in the middle of implied and explicit, because the text does more than just imply he's trans. He's basically already confirmed to be trans. It's simply not stated outright. But the subtext is clear about what we're meant to gather about this character. You can't prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that Jax is not trans. Even outside of queer representation, I think a lot of the time, having something implied rather than it being the main focus helps it feel more real. I doubt Jax would feel as real and personal if his character constantly talked about being trans, the same way a character like the Doctor from The Good Doctor is bad autistic representation because they make it the autism show, which contrasted with House, which funnily enough was created by the same guy. It is way worse representation because in House, it isn't the point of the text. It's just a part of who he is, like many other parts. It feels real and tangible, rather than fake and superficial. So, when the Amazing Digital Circus finale comes out and Jax doesn't say, "I'm the amazing digital tranny," don't be surprised or upset, because it is still trans representation anyway.